Thank you for tuning in to Fancy-Free Philosophy, the world-renowned and highly profound pinnacle of broadcast professionalism. I'll give 5 sentences of background before we discuss a tweet by David Hogg. He expressed a very common idea and sentiment, especially among progressives, and the farther left you go, the more common that idea is. David Hogg was one of the kids from Parkland High School. Let me just say that any kids who went to that school, and especially the ones who witnessed that terrible shooting, we should have sympathy for. That's terrible. That's just terrible, and no one should have to go through that. But with these kids, the corporate media made them famous after the school shooting there. The media's usually overwhelming left-wing bias often motivates them to use children and teenagers as sort of a human shield, as spokespeople for their progressive ideas, in order to shield those ideas from criticism. When people criticize the political ideas, the Democrat corporate media complex then dishonestly accuses those people of attacking children, so they're nasty people. It's an emotionally manipulative tactic used by these ideological propagandists, pretending to be news people. Anyway, on the screen now is David Hogg's February 4th tweet, which says, "A majority of the people that live in the United States are the descendants of illegal colonizers that committed a mass genocide." How close to the mark is this? I'll give my assessment, and then a compressed version of the story of the early American settlers, focused mostly on the Plymouth colony to provide additional evidence. The info is from a book, an article, and a video I put in the description and highly recommend, especially the video and the book. I believe it's wrong to steal credit without crediting people, so to steal their work. So I like to give credit. Now, first off, the common claim of genocide is total BS. 90% of Native American deaths were due to an epidemic of smallpox, which occurred long before germ theory was developed, so was not an act of biological warfare. Europeans had a much larger cultural universe from trading with Asia and the Middle East for centuries, which made them immune to many diseases that the Native Americans were not immune to. Now, I'm not attacking David Hogg, remember that. He seems like a nice kid, just criticizing the ideas in this tweet. So second, the accusation of illegality is easily debunked. At the time, only a few million people of dozens of tribes inhabited what is now the United States and had no legal code prohibiting the settlement of this vast landmass. The third, the progressive left almost universally ignores that every border on the current world map was established from war, conquest, genocide, and many other violent historical events of mass violence. In fact, the Indian tribes often conducted wars and conquest among themselves long before the arrival of Europeans. Just one example, the Comanche conquered vast areas of land by killing or forcing out the Pueblo, Apache, and Jumano Indians in the southern plains. According to some reports, they nearly wiped out the Apache people. If that was done by the Europeans, the progressive left would call that genocide. But the Comanche aren't white, so they just ignore it. The Comanche's ancestral homeland was Wyoming. And then in the 1600s, they moved from these lands and mountains in the north into the southern plains. They adopted the horse into their culture and quickly conquered vast areas of land through subjugation and warfare. They were merciless in their wars of conquest, killing all adult male captives, killing babies, and abducting children between the ages of 3 and 10. They tortured captives, often brutally, which included burning people alive. Now, in my opinion, it's obvious we shouldn't morally condemn the modern Comanche descendants of these brutal conquerors. Likewise with European descendants. Instead of morally condemning white people whose ancestors may or may not have stolen native lands or owned a slave, etc., which they have nothing to do with. During the peak of American slavery, only about 6% of Southern whites owned one or more slaves, meaning less than 3% of white Americans, since the North had a much higher white population. So actually, it's probably closer to 2% of U.S. whites at the time. And by the way, about 30% of free Southern blacks owned one or more slaves. Also, over 60% of American whites today are descended from people who immigrated here after the abolition of slavery, which further lowers the percentage of present-day whites whose ancestors owned slaves. The waves of European immigrants in the era around 1900 is well known and makes this an obvious consideration, but it's conveniently ignored in political discussions on race and slavery. An argument that today we should condemn whites but not Comanches is a form of racism towards both whites and Comanches that's hard to spot because the modern culture we're engulfed in treats that argument as an anti-racist one. I address this not to defend any race out of tribalistic motivation, but to defend everybody from ideas that demean us. That argument is racist toward whites because it treats their entire race as a uniquely morally inferior. And it's racist toward Comanches and other people of color because it only expects them to meet a lower standard of morality, as if we somehow can't expect them to meet as high of a moral standard as we expect from whites. If you disagree, don't hesitate to point out any errors I might have made, because the truth is far more important than pretending to be right. To me, it seems that argument, uniquely condemning whites, appears plausible at first glance, because in recent history, the Europeans colonized more square miles of land than any other race. But this is only due to superior technology. Genghis Khan's conquest was not limited by his moral concerns, obviously because he took sex slaves and committed other brutalities. But he was actually limited by technological and logistical limitations. And the same applies to Arab and Asian conquest and colonialism, which doesn't excuse any wars of aggression or conquest conducted by Europeans, but reveals that every other race on Earth also did the very same things. Now, to also briefly touch on the related subject of slavery, progressives often target Europeans as enslavers, which is true, but they ignore that slavery was a practice of almost every human society in recorded history, including most likely the majority of Native American tribes, many of whom practiced cannibalism, that the Mohawks practiced cannibalism, and they also practiced genocide. Like the Comanches completely wiped out the Apache almost. So, to move on here, the African slave trade began around the 600s or 700s when the African warlords who abducted millions of other Africans and sold them into slavery to the Arabs over centuries. The Europeans started buying these slaves around 700 to 800 years later in the 1400s from these African and Arab slave traders. But the Arabs enslaved at least 200 to 250 million Africans. About 112 million Africans died due to the barbaric treatment that the Arabs practiced. The Arabs would cut off the penises and scrotums of male slaves often at a young age, around 7 to 11 years old. They did this with unsanitary blades to make them eunuchs. Most of the 112 million deaths I mentioned were due to blood loss or infections from this barbaric practice because, like I said, they didn't sanitize the blades. Now, just to contrast some of these numbers real quick, about 500,000 African slaves were brought to America, and by the 1860s, America had about 4 million slaves, mostly from those slaves having kids, and then some Irish slaves. And then Europe had about a few million, maybe 10 million brought from Africa, which is just nowhere near the 200 to 250 million that the Arabs enslaved. So while the practice of slavery by Europe and America was obviously incredibly immoral, African slaves did have a much higher quality of life if they were sold to them instead of the Arabs. In fact, the practice of slavery still exists today in some regions of the Middle East. So to move on to the origins of America, in the lands that would later become the 13 original colonies, just regarding the original settlements of the Pilgrims and settlers in the 1600s, I haven't seen even one case in which they settled on stolen land. I'm talking about the original early 1600 settlements from sea voyages or pioneers from those first settlements creating their own towns. There's probably a case, there might be a case of that, but I haven't seen one where those people stole the land. For an example, let's look at the story of the Mayflower Pilgrims. It's very interesting stuff. They came from a separatist church that thought the Church of England was so corrupt that it could not possibly be reformed. A lot of these separatists were persecuted, so they came to the New World for religious freedom as one of their prime motivators. The Mayflower first landed in an unsettled area called Provincetown Harbor sometime around November. For context, in the decade or two before the Mayflower's arrival, bubonic plague and widespread tribal warfare by Indians trying to capitalize on the chaos all resulted in very sparsely populated land by the time the Pilgrims arrived. So at this first location, the Mayflower Pilgrims refused to loot what appeared to be Indian burial places. Despite finding bows and arrows there, they would have been useful, but they said, quote, "It would be odious unto them to ransack their sepulchres." And then that's the end of the quote. Soon came the Pilgrims' first encounter with any living natives. So at least 30 Indians descended on the Pilgrims, screaming war cries and flinging arrows. With incredible luck, not one of the Mayflower Pilgrims left the encounter with a scratch. But wait a minute. According to the progressive left's narrative of white people bad, Native Americans good, weren't the evil white Europeans always the oppressive ones who started all the violence? Well, maybe these 30 or so Indians who did that attack without being provoked, perhaps it was just a hallucination and Pilgrims ate some funky mushrooms that day, but I digress. Since it seemed like their new neighbors didn't like them, to say the least, their leader, William Bradford, set out to look for a better settlement option. And, they all got back on the ship, and a month later, he discovered Plymouth Bay. That appeared to be an excellent place for agriculture, so the Pilgrims settled here around December. Did they steal the land? It seems impossible to me, since their first encounter with another living human occurred 3 months later, on March 16th. So a single Indian walked out of the woods. He saluted his new neighbors, saying 2 words, "Welcome, Englishmen." His name was Samoset. He was tall, with long hair, no beard, and naked as a newborn baby. Something notable, since some progressives seem to racialize every issue, the Pilgrims made no mention in their records of his race or color of his skin. He was a Sachem Indian from up in Maine who learned English from fishermen there, and amazingly happened to be visiting a nearby tribe at precisely the time and the area that the Pilgrims accidentally landed, in Massachusetts Bay. The Pilgrims' original destination was 300 miles away, the Manhattan Island in New York, and yet another incredible coincidence soon happened. In the following days, Samoset returned with another Indian who spoke virtually perfect English and chatted with the Pilgrims about his favorite areas of Spain and his favorite neighborhoods in London. His name was Squanto. Years earlier, Squanto was abducted by Thomas Hunt, sold into slavery in Spain, and then escaped or was possibly rescued by monks. He somehow made his way to England, took a ship voyage to Newfoundland, and eventually walked all the way down to Plymouth, where the Pokanoket Indian chief enslaved him. After landing 300 miles off their mark, the Pilgrims miraculously stumbled on perhaps the only other native in the entire Western Hemisphere with a command of the English language. If anything on either Squanto's or the Pilgrims' timeline changed, they'd likely never have met. Perhaps we're seeing the fingerprints of God's handiwork. I'll skip to the first violent and almost violent events of this story, since today's topic is addressing the allegations of stolen land and violence blamed on the American colonists. If you'd like the whole story, I'll make a video, but if you want that video sooner, just leave a comment to let me know. So, most local Indian tribes got along nicely with the Mayflower Pilgrims. Within 2 years of the first Thanksgiving, there was almost a conflict with the Narragansetts, who refused to abide the Pokanoket English alliance. They threatened war by sending arrowheads wrapped in snakeskin to the Pilgrims and Squanto. The Pilgrims responded to this unprovoked threat by sending bullets and gunpowder wrapped in snakeskin through the United States Postal Service. Well, okay, I lied about the Postal Service part, but yeah, after that, they got along fine with the Narragansetts. Then, to make Plymouth great again, the Pilgrims built the Wall, a big, beautiful 8-foot-tall wooden wall to protect themselves from any potential Indian aggression in the future. Indian relations continued relatively well. Actually, very often, the Pilgrims played the part of peacemakers and intervened on behalf of their Indian friends with other tribes. At one point, the Pokanoket chief, Massasoit, fell very ill. The Pilgrims saved his life by rushing to his deathbed, cleaning his sores, cooking him food, administering what little medicine they had, and doing anything they could, no matter how degrading. Very grateful, Massasoit thanked the English Pilgrims by warning them of the Indian tribe called the Massachusetts, having plans to unleash an unprovoked attack on their colony. This put William Bradford in a tough spot. He didn't want to attack the Massachusetts without provocation, but if they waited for the Massachusetts to strike, then they were doomed. So what happened? Bradford gave the order, a man named Standish set the trap, and the English avoided a war by carrying the head of a Sachem Indian named Watuamat back to Plymouth. The Massachusetts, conspiring against the Pilgrims, then realized their plan was discovered, so they apologized profusely and made amends. Massasoit continued to become more powerful and influential, united many tribes together, and for the first time created the Wampanoag Nation. An indispensable part of making this possible was the Pilgrims playing the role of peacemakers for so long during the time leading up to its creation. After that, peace persisted for decades. By the mid-1600s, Harvard College welcomed Indian students, as the colony's common schools and grammar schools had for many years. Indians were among the first Harvard alumni in the school's history, around 350 years ago. Those early Plymouth settlers, in a friendly, consensual, and voluntary manner, sought to save and convert the Indians. Missionary John Eliot developed a written language for the Massachusetts and Algonquins, which they hadn't yet developed. Eliot translated the entire Bible for them. He created a phonetic version of their languages and used it to translate both the Old and New Testaments for both tribes to be able to read it, if they chose to. The English cared enough for the Indians to put effort into reaching out and saving their souls as they saw it. After over 55 years of peace between the English settlers and the Indians, that peace was only broken when Massasoit's own son Philip wrongly blamed the English for the death of his brother, who most likely died of appendicitis or some other natural ailment. Understandably emotional over the death of his brother, Philip vowed revenge and began selling off land to raise funds for war, thereby exacerbating the need for war. Local Indians warned the Plymouth colony of Philip's plans for war. Most notable was Indian John Sassaman, a Christian and a Harvard alumnus. Many local tribes rebuffed Philip's belligerence and sided with the English, including a Mohawk tribe. Philip made an alliance with the French against the English, betraying a 5.5-decade-long alliance. To keep this video shorter, I'll stop the story there and end our discussion of the Plymouth settlement with the thoughts of a historian. Historian Alden T. Vaughan was impressed by the Plymouth colonists' attempt to deal justly and peacefully with their Indian neighbors. For example, in 1638, Plymouth colony hanged 3 Englishmen for murdering an Indian. In their educational and judicial system and in their missionary efforts, the Plymouth colonists revealed a paternalistic but genuine concern for the Indians. We need more examples to fully see how the land was first acquired in the 1600s. Europeans didn't settle in Providence, in what would later become Rhode Island, until Roger Williams obtained a title from the Indians, and Connecticut and New Haven followed this same pattern. So to put it simply, they bought the land from the natives, and other settlements at the very least ensured they were not settling on claimed land. So settling on undisputed land obviously makes purchasing the land unnecessary. So from my research, it appears that in areas around Connecticut and New Haven, further settlements stemming off from those original settlements typically bought the land from the natives as well. And actually, in the Connecticut Valley, settlement was positively encouraged by some tribes in the 1630s. They hoped the English might prove a useful obstacle to the ambitions of the Pequots, which was a hated tribe that had begun to force its way into the area. Once settled, these New England colonies went on to purchase whatever additional land they desired, and they even allowed Indians hunting rights on these lands. My final points regarding unsettled land: the colonists did believe that deserted or desolate land could be occupied by whoever discovered it, but this idea was never used to dispossess Indians of their lands. If they did take the land, they didn't pretend it was unsettled. But actually, the taking of Indian land didn't really become a frequent thing until the 1700s, but especially not until the 1800s was it very common. But even then, it was far more common for whites in the 13 colonies and American whites later on to buy the land or to settle on unsettled territory. One big example from sometime in the 1780s and or the 1790s is when the U.S. Congress passed a bill for the settlement of the Ohio Territory, which some ambitious leaders who were regular citizens were planning for at least a few years or more. In that bill, they were legally prohibited from taking Indian land. They either had to buy it or settle in undisputed territory. Locations for the original Ohio settlements were picked out years in advance in completely unsettled areas. It's a pretty interesting historical topic, which I'll cover in another video. This video is to address the first origins of America in the 1600s with the original settlements. Anyway, thanks for tuning in, guys. There's a link in the description to my Subscribestar account if you'd like to donate and help make this a full-time Monday through Friday show in the future. That's the eventual goal. Also, please help by clicking like, and comments help too. It'll boost up my videos in the algorithms. I hope you enjoyed the video, and give me any feedback you want. I'll make a video show in the future and not just audio, but there's reasons I'm not right now. Thank you again for listening. Stay fly, long live philosophy, and I'll talk to you guys soon.